Transition. Beautiful. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on Twitch for your latest OK #1 stream. Very excited to have Jaden Janak and Mana Tahaie. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
Good.
Here for constructing abolition brick by brick, and kind of a follow-up part 2 to, well, not really, but a continuation of our first conversation with Jaden from last summer. And I don't really have much to plug or say, so I'm just gonna hand it over to you two. And yeah, please feel free to leave questions in the chat, and yeah, we'll do a Q&A at the end, and yeah, looking forward to it. Let me see how to make myself disappear. Okay.
Hey, Jaden.
Hi,
How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Good. I've been looking forward to this for a really long time.
Me too.
So what we're supposed to talk about, our talk is called Constructing Abolition Brick by Brick.
It
And we're
is.
supposed to talk about the relationship between surveillance and abolition
Mm-hmm.
and how we can create practices and communities that are safe from surveillance and policing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like 3 concepts there that I think would probably be useful to spend a little time explaining to folks, right? So we're talking about policing, surveillance, and abolition. For folks who don't know, this is like your whole jam. this is like Jaden Janak PhD brand. So can you bless us with your accessible, scholarly understanding of what we mean when we say policing, surveillance, and abolition?
Sure. So I like to think about, we'll start with policing. I like to think about policing expansively. So we can think about the actual police, the law enforcement, so sheriffs, police officers, detention officers. We can think about those people, but policing goes far beyond just folks who wear a uniform and have a badge and a gun. Policing is all around us. It happens in schools through teachers and counselors um, and what do they call the cops in schools?
School resource officers.
School resource officers.
That is some interesting branding right there. We can talk about
Yes, yes. I tend to just call them cops, but school resource officers. It happens interpersonally, so I wouldn't because I love Mana, but I could police Mana's gender and make Mana feel like she has to fit into a very tight box of what it means to be a woman, and that itself is a form of policing. Obviously, it's not on par with like shooting and hurting and maiming people, but it is a form of policing. And that sort of leads us to this idea about surveillance. So, surveillance, again, is also all around us. So, I wear an Apple Watch. This gives private entities like Apple, but also the government, access to information about my health, about my birth date, about all sorts of sensitive information that we would want to probably not have a bunch of people know about us. We often consent to having that information disseminated. So if you were to apply to college or take the ACT, you are actually consenting to have your sensitive data distributed to hundreds and thousands of colleges in the United States and around the world, and they use that data to send you brochures, which seems innocuous, except they can keep that data for an undisclosed amount of time and use it for whatever. which should scare us. Like, that's really scary. So that's just one form of surveillance. We also have like Ring doorbells, so those doorbells that are on apartments and houses that have cameras on them that have streaming video, and you can talk to people through them. We have CCTV cameras, which you'll find at businesses and universities, all sorts of ways that surveillance shows up in our lives. And lastly, we'll talk about the thing that hopes to undo all of those really terrible things that I just discussed, which is abolition. And abolition is a theory, is a school of thought, it is an organizing principle that states we have the ability to form communities that are safe and well and whole, and we can do that work outside of carceral systems, carceral ideologies, and we already have those tools. So often abolition will be talked about by its negators as aspirational or like far out of reach. But abolitionist scholars like Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore state that abolition is not aspirational. It's already unfolding in front of us. And so there are a myriad of organizations who are engaging in work that both undoes the carceral state, but also creates community structures of love and of solidarity, and those organizations exist right now.
So much good stuff I want to unpack there. When you talked about policing and you gave the interpersonal examples, it made me think, it gave me a really vivid sort of image of gatekeeping. Mm-hmm. This idea that like there is a way to be or a way to act or a way to align or a way to show up in the world that's like right and correct. And that's on the far side of some kind of barrier or restriction. Mm-hmm. And then there are forces that determine whether you're allowed in to like the right side, the correct side, or not. And so, you know, when you gave the example of policing gender, it just makes me think of all the ways that we gatekeep, right? Mm-hmm. And so then I think about law enforcement and what sort of the explicit policing, right, as being sort of uber gatekeeping with violence, right, with access to like the machinery of war. So I just wonder what you think about that, about the idea of like, because I'm constantly thinking about the ways that the carceral state is a result of like these deeply embedded values in our culture.
For sure. And yeah, I think about the same thing. I think often in these conversations, we talk about the big apparati, and that is important work. And I think that if we break it down to an interpersonal level, we can understand how we all participate in policing, and that participation then justifies and builds up the big systems that we can talk about with police violence and the military-industrial complex, etc. So yeah, I think you're spot on there. And
I think that the flip side of what you're saying that's empowering to me, right, is if I can identify the embedded, oftentimes invisible cultural norms and values that are showing up for me in my interpersonal interactions that reinforce the carceral state, then I can also dismantle it even in my own life, right? So like I can actively resist the practice of gatekeeping. And that's like, you know, a way of in my own life dismantling part of the carceral system.
Right, exactly. So like I'm a firm believer in the old feminist adage that the personal is political, and it seems really overwhelming to think about the prison industrial complex as a thing that we need to take apart. But if we can start from small nuggets that are just in our own personal day-to-day lives, we can get to the bigger system, I think. and that's how I like to think about it. And it reminds me of an article. I want to say this is actually in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, by Paula Rojas, called The Cop in Our Head and Hearts. And she talks about how carcerality lives in the way that we think about the world. It's in the way that we think about our siblings who are unhoused. It's in the ways that we segregate bathrooms. It's in the way that we segregate sports. It's in the way that we interact with one another, and even with people we call friend and family and comrade. And it's our job, as folks who are trying to think about that relation, to try to break it, and to recognize when it happens, and to try to do better.
And I think for me, it always helps sort of if I'm trying to become more aware of it, and once I do become more aware of it in my day-to-day life, then it's harder not to see it elsewhere, right? It sort of visibilizes the system by because I'm questioning those things that what we otherwise take for granted just in my day-to-day life. So I'm like, oh, well, if this isn't okay, then that's really not okay. And it kind of gives me an entry point into like challenging the bigger systems and interrogating some of these sort of implicit norms that we just take for granted, because like that's just how society is. Like a society without prison, what do you mean? Well, what if we just didn't actually confine people because we have a moral judgment against them? Like it's just, to me, it's really freeing to kind of see it. There's something else you said earlier that had to do with sort of the sort of big data, you know, the collaboration between tech and the state and things like that. And you mentioned that we consent to having our information shared. And I know you meant consent with like a big old asterisk, right? So can you talk like what does that even, can we consent? Like, is there a consent? Is there even an opt-out, right? Like, what does it mean to concede? That's the right word, right? To give consent to something that is so much big, like who reads the end user license agreement, right? Like, and even if we didn't want to be on Facebook or have an Apple Watch or something like there's some of these have become like the public square, right? So what does consent look like when your options are what they are? Can you concede not to go to the grocery store because there's, you know, a camera there? Or like, is there something more than just saying, I just opt out of this?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, like I'm definitely referring to consent with a very large, very detailed asterisk that probably is the length of a user agreement. But yeah, surveillance is everywhere. So there are certain forms of surveillance that like we could individually opt out of, I suppose. But even the fact that we're having this conversation about abolition through, I'm on an Apple device, through Zoom, and then to Twitch, like that is a transferring of information from us to space back down to us and all around, in a way that we can't control. So there are parts of this that we can try to limit the amount of information about us that is available if we desire to do that. But as you said, yes, like surveillance is everywhere. At the grocery store, you can't, I mean, we need food, so.
And that's where that sort of individual intervention becomes, the need becomes collective, right? Like I can't maybe individually opt out of CCTV at my grocery store, but if I, along with my neighbors, all of us who shop at this grocery store, collectively decide, no, this isn't acceptable for us, right? And then we have collective action. That's where I think we begin to see change. We've seen that in communities, right? We've seen communities that organize against the surveillance apparatus, whether it's the CVE, you know, program, or it's school resource officers, or, you know, insert other examples here.
For sure.
There's a question that just got dropped in the chat, and I haven't read it yet, so we're going to discover this together. Hmm. Gaming Juvenilian Satyr. I probably butchered that. I apologize. There's some great scholarship done on this post Tuskegee in the medical field that hasn't filtered everywhere else. But a proper ethical consent is one where the person consenting doesn't just give permission, but affirmatively understands what they're consenting to. Yeah, so just like a sure, I guess, is not exactly consent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Consent is so interesting. You know, I have a lot of friends with kids in my life, and all of my little nibblings are like so dear to me, and it's really interesting to think about how to interact with children in ways that like uphold my values, right? Because like we have such, I don't know, skewed ways of dealing with children that like really reinforce some toxic stuff, right? There's a lot of like adultism, and I remember the first time one of my friends was like, had come over and brought their daughter over and said, hey, you know, give your auntie a hug, and the kiddo didn't want to, and then, you know, the parent was like, come on, like give your auntie a hug, and I said, nope, I firmly believe in bodily autonomy. This kid gets to, you know, have whatever interaction they want with whomever they want whenever they're comfortable. And I could just see in my friend like the light going off, because they also believe in bodily autonomy, but we just take it for granted sometimes. And I was like, no, this is how you teach consent. This is how you encourage kids to believe their body belongs to them and is not like part of the public domain, especially girls. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the maybe less visible iterations of the surveillance state and how it kind of seeps into our lives so insidiously. Can you talk about things like that we don't really think about as much, like the foster care system?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and I know that yeah, can be difficult to discuss because so many people have formed families through the foster care system, and eventually through like foster to adopting, and so I want to be respectful of that and acknowledge the ways that the foster care system impacts, in particular, Black and brown mothers, but specifically Black mothers. The way that the state gets to determine who is fit and who is unfit as a parent, and the metrics they use to determine those things are race, class, and gendered. And they particularly affect Black women, single Black women. And this goes all the way back to the Moynihan Report and this understanding of Black families as embedded in a tangle of pathologies, and that families that don't have a Black man present are matriarchal, and that is somehow a bad thing. And this is where we get the idea of the welfare queen that Ronald Reagan eventually popularized. So when I think about the foster care system, I have to think about, first, who is allowed to be foster parents, what support do they receive, and how could that support from the state be utilized in ways that meet the needs of parents who have their children taken from them. I'm not going to say that there aren't folks who are struggling and have needs, right? So like that's real. However, I do firmly believe that, and science backs us up on this, that folks are better served when, kids in particular are better served when they're able to stay in their original home environment, whatever that is and whatever configuration that takes. And so I think when I'm thinking about the foster care system, I think about the impact on on the families receiving children, on the families losing children, and on the children themselves, who have no say and really limited say in what happens over their bodies. As you mentioned, bodily autonomy of youth within the foster care system is not held to a very high, it is not a highly valued thing. And yeah, I think there are ways to talk about the foster care system and also adoption, the buying and selling of people, in a way that honors both, the sensitive nature of those who form families that way, but also gets to you like the underlying problems within the system.
And I think of foster care as sort of a subset or a a tool of the larger child welfare state, right? And child welfare, while similarly, complex and not inherently problematic necessarily, it is, however, a way of introducing the state into the private lives of families, right? It invites surveillance into the homes of, as you say, predominantly Black, brown, and poor neighbors and residents, whose poverty becomes like justification, right? For people coming in, for the state to come in and monitor their fitness, so to speak. And as our mutual friend Vic Weiner was explaining to me, that the interesting thing about both the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system is that like the authority of the state isn't just over the child, right? It then extends to the whole family. So if you have a kiddo who's struggling, suddenly that sort of criminalizes the parents and the grandparents and the siblings and whoever else is in the house, and then suddenly the whole family unit is under scrutiny and being monitored by the state. And because the carceral state is punishment driven rather than solution driven, right? The thing that people get dinged for never gets solved, right? So you might have a social worker from child welfare come into a family's house and say, well, it's dirty, and therefore a child needs to be taken out of that home. Not, it's dirty, therefore this family could use a little help. Let's just get them some help, right? And so I think that the surveillance apparatus is a tool of keeping an eye on and then extracting people from communities into confinement, which I think is like the ultimate goal, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to to say this explicitly, that this is not accidental. This is not a random outcome. That this is part and parcel of the design. Black and brown and poor people being targeted by the state, and the state coming into folks' homes and scrutinizing what's happening in people's homes and then extracting them from those homes into prison, jail, or immigration detention is not random, or whoops. It's what the thing is set up to do.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned earlier the Moynihan report, and I have to take every opportunity to sort of jump on my soapbox and rail against a very common and very popular framework that's used by a lot of social workers called Bridges Out of Poverty, popularized or created by a woman with no credentials named Ruby Payne, who essentially took all of the principles of the Moynihan report and the bell curve kind of culture of poverty ethos and rewrote them in this seemingly innocuous, almost empathetic sounding framework that still pathologizes all the same things. And it still, enables extreme judgment and surveillance of poor families. So I just feel like I want to take every opportunity to say, down with Bridges Out of Poverty. If it's in your workplace, if it's in your curriculum, please think more critically about this framework. Because all it is those same tired ideas, repackaged and causing harm, continuing to cause harm.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a feeling that the majority of our audience has, you know, similar political leanings. Probably didn't tune into a talk called Constructing Abolition Brick by Brick because they're, you know, huge, like, thin blue line proponents. So I think actually it's a really good transition, because I think Bridges Out of Poverty is um, it's a very commonly accepted framework among a certain subset of, like, otherwise very, like, progressive, you know, liberal leaning, oftentimes white women, just because that's the social work field and that's where that framework really dominates. And so I think about all the other ways that, like, the abolition conversation gets caught up and like hits obstacles even among folks who are sort of left of center, right? Who you know might say things like, sure, I would support State Question 805 and reduce mandatory sentencing, but what about, you know, and then oftentimes it's domestic violence or rape or things like that. And these exceptions get carved out, which then just reinforce the system in the first place. So can you talk about, in your experience, what are the common, like, tripping up points when it comes to kind of challenging the surveillance state among folks who would otherwise, if they could just, you know, do a small paradigm shift, be really on board?
Yeah, so I would say we'll sort of start from, we'll just start here. We'll start with the idea that if we abolish private prisons, then we're good to go.
Mm, mm,
And that idea, yeah, and Dr. Angela Davis has taken responsibility for propagating that idea, but she was one of the early proponents of this idea that if we need to attack private prisons. Now, if we know that 95% of the prison population, so think expansively, not just people in prison, but jails, detention facilities, etc., are actually under state public jurisdiction.
That's us. Public.
Yeah,
That's us, all of us.
public.
Yeah.
Taking private prisons away leaves 95% of folks untouched. Which is not to say that private prisons are good. Definitely not. But we need to think more expansively about what prison abolition is really asking us to do. And as I feel like all I'm going to do is say Dr. Ruthie Gilmore's name a bunch of times, but what she always says is that,
fine.
yeah, I stand, that's fine. What she always says is that prison abolition requires one thing, that we change everything. And that means that we can't stop at private prisons. We also can't stop at binaristic, alienating dichotomies like violent versus nonviolent offenders. So that's often another thing that will come up. Folks are like, okay, yeah, nonviolent offenders, people who are in jail for having a joint, yeah, like they absolutely shouldn't be in jail or prison. Free them yesterday. But things get a little more complicated when we talk about literally anybody else. Anybody else who's in prison, who's not in prison for, who's not being criminalized for addiction, but is in prison because of domestic violence or because of homicide or because of insert other complicated issue. And that's when we start to lose some of our left of center liberal friends who say, like, this person is violent. They need to be separated from our community in order for us to be safe. And my response to that is often for us to look at the greater landscape of sexual and gender-based violence. So sexual and gender-based violence can happen from person to person, a one-on-one, two-on-one, three-on-one situation. It also happens within systems. So if we think about jails and prisons, within those facilities, there is great amount of gender-based and sexual violence just from the ways that jails are set up. So you have men's facilities and women's facilities, and based on federal and state guidelines, people who are trans can go and can be put wherever. And there's very little actual oversight into how that happens. So if a trans person gets put in a facility in which they don't belong, that is a form of sexual and gender-based violence. And so I would encourage our left of center and liberal friends to really think about not only like things like where people are placed, but also the violences that happen within those facilities. That does happen from prisoner to prisoner, but most often happens from administrator to prisoner. And if we are concerned about sexual and gender-based violence, we need to be concerned about prisoners, and we need to be concerned about confining people in the first place, and the psychological, spiritual, and physical impacts that confinement has on individuals. And so, yeah, those are usually the top three that we get. That's usually what we get.
Yeah, and similarly, the same patterns of gender-based violence exist among law enforcement. We know that, there's an enormously disproportionate, outsized number of people in law enforcement who are themselves, perpetuators or perpetrators, both, of gender-based violence, in their own homes. And so the idea that these systems are supposed to protect us, whomever us is determined to be, against them, whoever them is determined to be. And of course, us and them in American culture is always subject to white supremacist notions of who is safe and who is dangerous, who is violent and who is nonviolent, who is, deserving of punishment versus who is deserving of protection. But ultimately, these ideas that like we need to be protected from or against them, and in doing so, we use a system that is somehow violence free, when in fact it is an enormous, reinforcer of violence, right? I mean, our prisons and jails are incredible sites of harm and factories for violence. I'm going to back up a little bit because Betances asked a question about a prior topic that I think is a really good observation. And it says, this question is late, but your discussion about the child welfare state led me to think about mandatory reporting, which is commonly talked about in my field. Every adult in Oklahoma is a mandatory reporter, and we need to assess if a child is being harmed or neglected, and then report that to DHS and or the police. So what are your thoughts on mandatory reporting and the interaction that has with the surveillance apparatus in the carceral state?
Yeah, so as someone who's seemingly never-ending journey through academia continues, the first place I go to think about this is Title IX, which is landmark legislation for oppressed gendered people in sports, but also created the infrastructure that protects universities from complicity in sexual harm that happens on their campus or by people associated with their campus. And so I think about mandatory reporting because I am a mandatory reporter as part of my job as a teacher. And I think about Title IX, and my first question, I guess a question in response to our good comrade's question, is who does mandatory reporting serve? Who is it designed to serve? Who is it said to serve? And who does it actually serve? And these are the same questions I would ask about the police, about prisons, about capitalism, about the military. But those three questions are always imperative to answer. And I would say that mandatory reporting is a way for private and public entities to protect themselves from litigation. And secondly, I would say that it is deeply connected to the carceral state and is a way for disappearing Black and brown and poor people. It's just another way that the state can creep into a situation where harm may have occurred and may not have occurred at all, and people get disappeared, and that impact has impact for generations. And so that's what I would say. Like, mandatory reporting, like you mentioned, everyone who's an adult in Oklahoma is a mandatory reporter. In very few cases have I ever seen that actually help people. And oftentimes it creates even further harm.
Yeah, because I mean, things like that rely on the discretion of the reporter to determine whether there is abuse or neglect. And that what that means is that we're automatically going to fall back on all of the cultural messages, you know, and biases that we carry around about, again, who's dangerous, who's fit for parenting, and all of that. And so as anytime a policy or a system or a practice or anything like that relies on the discretion of lay people, all of whom are subject to white supremacist bias, right? That is going to inherently punish people who are already viewed by society as being problematic. So, you know, like you said, we're all carrying around the welfare queen trope in our heads, right? We don't have to believe in it for it to be an insidious sort of, you know, tape sort of playing in the back of our minds, so that when we see, you know, a Black mother reprimanding her child, we see violence there in a way that we wouldn't see in a white mother perhaps doing the same thing. So it's always going to reify these sorts of things, and as you say, so eloquently, disappear, right, these families, further dismantling the stability of families that then get pathologized by the state, right, for their own dismantling, right, their own instability that has been like state sanctioned. So yeah, thank you, Betances, for that question. That was a good sidebar. Let me do a quick time check. How are we doing? About 20 minutes left. I want to pivot eventually to that whole concept of constructing. But is there anything else that you want to make sure we sort of provide in our initial analysis or our framing? Anything else about the surveillance state that you feel like it's important to share here?
Yeah, there's one thing that I always feel the need to mention, because sometimes with the large dissemination of an idea like abolition, sometimes things can get lost in translation. And so it's important for me to always mention that surveillance, policing, and even abolition did not begin with the creation of the first police department. That this way of relating to the world began a long time ago, and we have to have conversations about policing and surveillance that include the transatlantic slave trade. We cannot have a conversation about policing, about the breaking apart of families, about the pathologizing of families, about the state and private interests deciding who can be a family and what a family looks like. We can't have those conversations without talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And yeah, for me, that's important, because what I don't want, and I've seen this even at fancy abolition conferences, I've seen this where folks will have a conversation about the criminal justice system that begins with criminologists like Jeremy Bentham, which, yes, like obviously phrenology and like I'm gonna feel around your head, and if you have a bump here or a bump there, you're a criminal and you're destined for evil. Like obviously that's part of the creation of a carceral state. But what that does is both it both gives these European philosophers credit for creating the oppression that they definitely did not create, that they inherited. But it also gives these philosophers, and Jeremy Bentham in particular, because people really like him for whatever reason, it also makes them responsible for like reforming punishment regimes and just reifies white supremacy. So we're not gonna do that. We're not doing that today. And I just want it to be known that prison abolition cannot be separated from the movement to abolish slavery. That is still absolutely ongoing, and it's not a fight that is over by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, so that's actually a really great pivot point. So if not Jeremy Bentham, who should we be listening to? Who does have some more perhaps comprehensive analysis? Who does have some ideas that we can endorse and get behind? You've already mentioned Ruthie Gilmore, of course. You've mentioned Angela Davis. By the way, I was so grateful that you said that Angela Davis sort of took responsibility for propagating an idea that she later realized was wrong, because I think we need to model that more, right? We need to say, oh, my thoughts were different before, and I learned more information and I developed, right? And I was thinking about that this morning because I got on Facebook, and it tells you your memories. What were you doing 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago? And it's such a good exercise for me to see what it was I was like celebrating or advocating for a few years ago that I've sort of grown beyond, right? So like literally today I saw myself commenting or posting about something 6 years ago on, today 6 years ago, in support of or in celebration of hate crimes legislation, right? Because at the time I was like, yes, this is what we want, right? And now I've really come to like do an entire pivot on hate crimes legislation, because I don't believe in anything that further criminalizes anybody, but we know anything that criminalizes Black and brown bodies. Because again, who is going to get the brunt of this? Who is going to get, the worst parts of this? So anyway, here's to Angela Davis modeling for us that we can all grow and evolve. As Adrienne Marie Brown says, all organizing is science fiction, right? We're just imagining a new world, and sometimes it's beyond our imagination until it's not. So anyway, just want to shout out to the mentors who are teaching us that it's okay to be wrong and course correct. So yeah, you love to see it. So who else do you take inspiration from?
Yeah, so I take inspiration from Mariame Kaba, who is another well-known. We love to see the book placement. She just recently wrote a fantastic book that Mana just modeled for us in Vanna white form.
Again, in case it was too fast.
Yeah, there you go. Take a screenshot, everyone. It's available through Haymarket Books in Chicago. And Mariame Kaba is responsible for the founding of numerous organizations, but most notably Survived and Punished in New York, as well as Project NIA in Chicago, which works to dismantle the juvenile justice system brick by brick. And so I take a lot of inspiration from her as someone who is seasoned and has participated in many different aspects of abolitionist organizing, from transformative justice circles to building and managing organizations to being a prolific writer. And now she's in graduate school doing archival work. And she recently had an archive actually established in her name in Chicago at the Harold Washington Library. So she's another person that I take a lot of inspiration from. And then there are other folks who, people like Dean Spade, who is a white trans person who does incredible work around the criminalization and pathologizing of trans people, of queer and trans people, and how things like hate crimes legislation are actually counter to queer liberation. And he was one of the first abolitionist writers that I ever read in early college years that really sparked my mind to the potential of this idea and of this movement. And lastly, I would share someone like Beth Ritchie, who was involved in Insight, which was an organization dedicated to eliminating gender-based violence. So she was involved in Insight, and she was involved in organizing for 25, 30 years. And she wrote a fantastic book called Arrested Justice, which talks about how the criminal justice system impacts Black women and girls in particular. And she gave us a wonderful framework for understanding the prison nation, as well as matrices of violence that occur within the criminal justice system. So those are the people that those are some. I mean, I could sit here and talk about abolitionists forever, but those are some of the people that I really take my lead from, people who are both scholars as well as organizers, and their organizing inspires their scholarship and vice versa.
Yeah, big ups to Lucas, who's putting a lot of links into the Twitch chat of all the things you're mentioning. I want to say specifically that Haymarket Books is doing a special right now for, they're calling it their Abolitionist Starter Kit. So this book, along with 4 others, including Angela Davis's foundational work and 3 other books, are all for sale right now. 5 books for $50. So get you some starter kit learning there. Also, Miriam Kaba is the master of presenting the information in just the most creative ways. So she's got zines, she's got blog posts, she's got podcasts, she does a little of everything. And so on the Project NIA website, there's a great resource called Building Your Abolitionist Toolkit. And it's a lot of, the subtitle is Everyday Resources for a Punishment-Free World. So she's really stellar. And the last thing I want to say as far as resources go is that a couple of friends of mine over at Project South just released a report, I think yesterday or the day before, that is so central to exactly what we're talking about here today, the role of the surveillance state in the larger sort of carceral apparatus. And that report is called Spying on the Margins, the history, law, and practice of US surveillance against Muslim, Black, and immigrant communities, and contemporary strategies of resistance. So that last part's really inspiring, and that's kind of where I want to go next. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. It's not going to let me because I'm not logged in. All right, Lucas, I'm going to drop this in our chat, and you can drop it in the Twitch chat. So, Jaden, we're here to construct abolition brick by brick. So let's talk about a couple bricks. What would you suggest to people as they are thinking about resisting the surveillance apparatus, right? And maybe more broadly, taking beginning steps toward constructing abolition in their own lives, in their communities, in their circles of influence, and in the broader society that they're in.
Yeah, so one thing that has been really healing and also eye-opening for me is eliminating the distance between me and people who are incarcerated. And the way that I do that, I was a teacher at a facility before the pandemic started, and I taught math, but that was like, I taught math, but I really like was there to see what people were up to and see what the folks who were incarcerated were thinking about in terms of their own confinement and other people's confinement, and what they wanted to do with the world once they eventually got out. And some of them, unfortunately, were not going to get out, but I was thinking, just wanted to see what folks were doing in the prisons. And that experience for me, hopefully we're able to do that again once the pandemic chills. Wear your mask, everyone, and get vaccinated.
Wear your mask. I'm done with this panini. We just all want to get back to normal, please.
Yes. Yeah, one of the things that really impacted me from that experience was just like being able to bear witness to people's stories. I think people have often said this, and I think that it's true, that really if you're thinking about putting on this abolitionist label, if you must label yourself in that way, it's imperative that you get close to those who are most affected by the criminal justice system. We are all affected, but we are not all affected equally. And so another way that I get proximate is through letter writing. So I maintain a number of pen pal relationships with people who are incarcerated. And because we are anti-border in this house, doing that helps cross the prison wall, that there's not this clear divider between those on the inside and those on the outside, between the good people and the bad people, that we are able to infiltrate those boundaries and those borders and really create relationships with one another. And just simply writing a letter to someone who's incarcerated can be a lifeline for folks who have very limited access to the outside world, whose families and friends may have abandoned them, and who need, not to be too dark, but who need reasons to live. And creating those relationships is one way that we eliminate the artificial boundaries that stand between us. And I would encourage folks there's a number of programs through which you can get connected with an incarcerated person. Black and Pink is one that is specifically geared towards queer and trans people. If you're more on the radical religious side, there's also an organization I work with called Abolition Apostles, and they have chapters in basically every state and on many college campuses, and you can get connected to pen pals that way too. But I would just say that's one step that's relatively easy to take. And
can I ask you something to sort of articulate something that may be implicit for you? But I often say that how you do something matters as much as what you do or that you do it, right? And so there's a way in which we can try and get proximate to communities that are edifying for both parties. And then there's a way in which we can do it that reinforces harm, that is very extractive, that is, still kind of, in this like human zoo kind of quality, for lack of a less crass way of putting it. So can you talk about when you are entering spaces, whether that's virtually or literally, in an attempt to get closer to or to break down barriers between yourself and people who are, in this case incarcerated, but in all cases more marginalized? How are you showing up in a way that doesn't reinforce harm?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you're right. I think I implicitly was talking about that without going into it. So one thing for me is to always be cognizant of the baggage I carry into any given situation. And so I think privilege is played out. So I'm going to use baggage instead, because it's something I don't want, but I have. Um, and one of those pieces of baggage is that I am a doctoral student. So I have letters behind my name that signify a thing in society. And that thing is to make people who don't have those letters feel bad that they don't have them.
Yeah.
And so I don't lead with that. I mention it because it's important to mention, but I don't like talking about like what I do, because I'm not there for research. If I were there for research, I would lead with that, but I'm not. I'm there as like Jaden the person. Jaden the academic is not present in those interactions. And so in that regard, I would say like you should be forthright with like why are you here? Are you here to mine my experience to like have some talk or write some book and make money off of somebody else's suffering, or are you
Or build
there?
up your liberal credentials.
Yeah, or build up your liberal credentials, or are you there to genuinely make a connection with someone and create relations of solidarity? And if you were there for the latter reason, I would just encourage folks to interact with those who are incarcerated or in other precarious situations as people, like not as research objects or animals in a zoo, but as people. Like, I am not just the books I read or the classes I attend. I'm also someone who loves women's soccer. And like that's something that I will talk to anybody about. And that's something that I talk to my pen pals about because it's a part of me. And yeah, I would just encourage folks to be intentional.
Awesome. I know that you have a specific resource you want to share with folks. I'll just throw out there when I think about really challenging the surveillance state in my personal life, I think about things like not getting a Ring doorbell, right? Because number one, that is a weird form of individual surveillance, but also because Amazon is cooperating with law enforcement, right? And there's a whole police department interaction, like agreement there. I think about things like not inviting the police into my neighborhood to drive through when there's a spike in opportunity crimes, which is something that I have to deal with in my neighborhood a lot, of telling people, no, I don't want more police in my neighborhood. And I even think about things like maybe reconsider Elf on the Shelf, because it's really just teaching your children that a culture of surveillance is like something you should aspire to, and compliance with a larger authority that's like behind the glass is maybe something, advisable, when that's not the culture we want to bring our kids up in. Do you want to talk about the 9 solidarity commitments? And I'll drop the link and you can close
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, for sure. So, one of the people that we mentioned in our conversation, Mariam Kaba, at the top of the year, she released a document called 9 Solidarity Commitments that you can make in the year 2021. And one of those things on that list is writing to incarcerated people. One of those tasks is joining phone banks or phone zaps to elevate specific incarcerated people or people at specific institutions. And so there are 9 things on the list, and they are things that are, yeah, I'm not going to say they're easy because they're not, and they're not designed to be that way, but they are first steps that one can take in the fight for abolition. And so this is one way that we can start creating the pace to start building our bricks brick by brick.
Well, Jaden, thank you. This was as good as I was hoping it would be, and better. So I appreciate you inviting me into this conversation. And thanks to Lucas for giving us a platform.
For sure. I wish